Okay, everyone, thank you very much. I want to welcome you to the webinar today, Better Responses to Youth Status Offenses. I'm noticing that my nice font didn't show up so well on this particular computer. But thank you very much for attending. Before we get started, I just want to run through a few things. I want to make sure that you're comfortable with the software. Your control panel, you'll notice that there's an orange arrow on the upper left-hand corner that acts as a toggle switch, so you can kind of push it out of your way if you want to see the full slides. If you are having trouble with audio, the best way generally is to call in using the phone number listed in your control panel if you look under audio. And then if you have a question during the presentation, we encourage you to type it into the chat box or questions box and send it to the panelists. In the interest of time, most questions are going to be answered at the end of the presentation. However, if you have a question for clarifying something, we'll try to make sure that that gets answered during the presentation. If we don't have time to get through all the questions, our presenters have kindly agreed to provide some written responses that we will email out several days after the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and it will likely be available on our website within the next day or so. I will send out that link and the supporting materials to all the registrants within a few days. So I just want to say a couple words about our sponsors today. First of all, the National Juvenile Justice Network leads a national movement of state-based organizations that are working to create a fair, equitable, and developmentally appropriate juvenile justice system for children, youth, and families. Our co-sponsor is the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, which is a nationwide coalition of state advisory groups dedicated to, and their allies, dedicated to preventing children and youth from becoming involved in the courts and upholding the highest standards of care for youth who end up in the system. I'm very, very proud today to be able to introduce our speakers today. First of all, we have Marie Williams, who is the Acting Executive Director for the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. She's responsible for developing, managing, and implementing nationwide initiatives in juvenile justice leadership and reform with CJJ's state partners and members. Andy Salsic, who directs the Center on Youth Justice at the Vera Institute of Justice, will be going next. She provides technical assistance and support to numerous jurisdictions across the United States, helping government officials develop, implement, and sustain safe and effective ways to reduce reliance on incarceration, decrease local and state expenditures, and ensure substantively sound outcomes for young people and their families in the community. And finally, we have Tara Grishop-Goodwin, who's Chief Policy Officer at Kentucky Youth Advocates, Kentucky's only multi-issue policy group focused on children and youth. Tara leads Kentucky Youth Advocates' work on improving youth justice in Kentucky, which includes ending the use of incarceration for status offenses. So want to welcome them all today, and I'm going to turn it over now to Marie first of all. Marie, you want to go ahead?
Great. Thanks, Benjamin. So I've got limited time and lots of slides, so if I'm speaking really quickly and there are things that come up as I'm presenting that you'd like me to cover in more depth, then I would encourage you to take advantage of the chat box, the chat window that we have to our right, and I'll get to those questions at the end. So a little bit about why CJJ is working on status offender reform. As Benjamin said, we are the national advocacy organization that represents state advisory groups. And what that means essentially is that we are the voice for those bodies that sit in the states. You all are probably familiar with them. They're authorized through the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which also has at its center 4 core requirements, one of which, of course, is DSO. And CJJ has had a long-time formal position on prohibiting detention of status offenders. And so what we're seeking to do is to advance in practice the policy change that we seek in the reauthorization of the JJDPA. And specifically what we want to do is restore the DSO core requirement of the JJDPA to its original state, and that is to remove the valid court order exception. Next slide. So the valid court order exception, for those of you who don't know, was added in 1984, and basically what it says is that youth charged with status offenses who violate a valid court order may be held in a secure juvenile facility for a period allowable by state and local law. And we believe that, unfortunately, over time, what's happened is that the VCO exception has basically swallowed the rule, right? So what we've seen is more and more status offenders being confined, despite the DSO core requirement under this exception, which we would like, ideally, to have removed from the reauthorization of the JJDPA. Next slide. So, folks ask quite a bit whenever I present on this issue. Even judges ask quite a bit, is the valid court order exception still used? Many of you are practitioners, and you know that it is. But what we see is that the nation is divided on this, right? So in total, we see that 28 states and territories prohibit or choose not to use the VCO. And of those, 14 have state laws that cite prohibitions. In 2008, and I think we've got more recent data, but this is what I've got for now, 27 of 55 states recorded allowable uses of the VCO exception as a part of their reporting on compliance with the JJDPA. Wyoming, of course, does not participate in the JJDPA. That basically means that the 4 core requirements that the other states who participate in the Act are required to adhere to, Wyoming does not adhere to. So what that essentially means is that Wyoming is free to lock up status offenders as many and as often as they like. And, other states that do use the VCO, I don't want to have sort of a doom and gloom scenario. Even those that do use it, what we've been seeing is that it's used in relatively few instances. Well, not few instances, but few places. So you may have a certain county or a certain court where the VCO is used in excess, and then in other parts of that state, it's very rarely used. So we've seen that approximately 9,850 VCO-related detention orders are issued annually across the United States in 27 jurisdictions. And, as I mentioned, it's typically a few courts or jurisdictions, but from our point of view, at least, we don't think that this exception should be used at all. Next slide. So why do we think status offenders should not be confined? I mean, we've got now a lot of data and a lot of information about the dangers of confinement. And some of the data that we've gathered over the years shows us that nearly 20% of status offenders, when they're placed in confinement, are placed in living units with youth who've killed someone. And just as a reminder, I'm sure I'm not telling anyone something that telling you guys stuff that you don't know, but status offenders are young people who've committed no crime, right? So they're in the juvenile courts for things like truancy, running away, being incorrigible, that kind of thing. So they've committed no crime, and yet they can be and are being placed in living units with young people who may have killed someone. Some of them reside with felony sex offenders. And then, more than half or around half we've seen have been asked to participate in programming with youth who've been charged with, murder and or rape. And when young people are detained, we know that the outcomes are not positive, right? That rather than sort of ameliorating whatever problems they may have had that led to them being in confinement, their reoffense rates increase, their school engagement and success are diminished necessarily because they're outside of the school environment, right? There's insecure confinement. And then if there are emotional, social, and familial problems, those are often exacerbated. They're not cured, and they're certainly not helped by their being in confinement. Next slide. So when CJJ talks about JJDPA reauthorization, we talk about phasing out the use of the VCO exception to the DSO core requirement. In fact, I think lately we've become a little bit more aggressive than that, and we want to basically remove the VCO exception, not phase it out. We also want to prohibit detention of children under the custody of child protection and child welfare agencies, because what we found is that many of the young people who are being confined as status offenders are in fact just young people who are under the custody of child welfare. We also want to place strict limits on lengths of stay in secure detention, not just for status offenders, but for all non-delinquent youth, and that would be inclusive of status offenders. We also want to provide funds to enrich the continuum of services for community-based and or family-connected care for status offenders. So what we've found through our research and the research of others is that status offenders are generally speaking young people who are in need of services. And of course, many, many states have recognized that distinction between status offenders and delinquent young people. And so, that's where you see your CHINs and your FINS systems, because there is a growing recognition that this population is a population of young people who need services, not secure confinement. Next slide. So the good news is that we're beginning to see broad consensus to eliminate all detention for youth charged with status offenses. This is not a position that CJJ originated, and we certainly don't claim any ownership over it. We've seen, even at JJDPA at the U.S. Department of Justice, that they concur that this is not an appropriate intervention for this population. U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee twice had the VCO removed from the version of the legislation that they passed. And of course, there are more than 300 organizations across the country, not just CUJJ, but also National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the American Bar Association, Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, and many, many others who agree that where status offenders are concerned, confinement is not the appropriate intervention for that population. Next slide. So quite apart from, some kind of ideological alignment that these organizations have, we've also begun to see that in practice, the national, state, and local trends support deinstitutionalization of status offenders. They are preventing, when possible, non-delinquent children from entering locked facilities, reducing out-of-home placements, reducing reliance on secure custody, and beginning to focus a lot more on family and community-connected services, because this is what the research indicates is most successful for this population. And I should add, not just for this population, but often for youth charged with delinquent and serious offenses as well. So the reliance on secure custody that we are urging be reduced for status offenders is also beginning to sort of trickle over into populations of youth who've been charged with delinquent offenses and serious offenses as well. Next slide. So there are some states that are leading the charge to avoid detention, and these are only some of them. There are many, many others that could be a part of this list as well. So recent efforts in VCO states would be states that allow the use of the valid court order exception. So Alabama, Louisiana, Ohio, Utah, and Washington. Those are states where judges are permitted by law to use the VCO to confine status offenders, and they've reduced their confinements and are practicing alternatives to detention. So there are other states also that have enacted legislative changes, so not just change in practice, but change in policy to move status offenders away from the delinquency system: Connecticut, Georgia, New York, and Pennsylvania, to name a few. All right, so I think I'm coming up on time. So before my time's completely out, I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that CJJ's been working on. So over the past 18 months to 2 years, we've been working with our partners, the Vera Institute of Justice, National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and others on what we call the SOS Project, Safety, Opportunity, and Success. And we've got 3 core strategies. I won't go over them here because I think you all are going to be getting copies of the slides anyway. But the one that I want to highlight would be the standards of care for youth charged with status offenses that we're going to be releasing in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So the standards are basically our effort to sort of codify what we believe to be best practices and policies as it relates to this population. And the slide that you're seeing sort of gives you an overview of what the sections of the national standards are. I'm not going to be able to go into each of these at length, but I would say that if you want a copy of the national standards and you want an opportunity to comment on them, you can email me, williams@juvejustice.org, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of the standards. And also through our partners at the Vera Institute of Justice, once the document has been sort of, complete, finalized, and ratified, it will be on Vera's Status Offense Resource Center, which is going to be launched very soon. Annie will be talking to you about that. So I'm going to close now so that my colleagues will have a chance to do their presentation. But if you have any questions for clarification, please feel free to ask them.
Thank you, Marie. We did have a couple of questions. I just want to reassure the questioners that they have been noted, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. I also want to reassure everyone that the slides will be available online. We will be sending them out along with a recording of this webinar to all registrants, so you should be getting that within the next couple days. So I want to turn now to our next presenter, Annie Salsic from the Vera Institute of Justice. Annie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. As Benjamin noted, I'm the director of Vera Institute's Center on Youth Justice. I'm going to offer some very brief background on Vera. I won't go into that into too much detail, but people can definitely check out our website for more information. And then I'll get right into the heart of the presentation for this afternoon. Vera, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We've been active for more than 50 years now. Our Center on Youth Justice specifically works with policymakers and practitioners who want juvenile justice to be rooted in the community, more effective and smaller in scale, and touching the lives of fewer children. We do this through research and technical assistance, and while we focus on many different areas of the juvenile justice system in our work, status offense reform has been central to our work and our portfolio and very close to our hearts for more than 12 years now. So next slide. So the presentation outline, I'll give you a brief update as to just what you have in store for you. I'm going to be keeping this brief as well, so a little more than 10 minutes, but not much more. So what I'll do is start with why status offense reform is so important. However, much of this echoes what Marie already shared, and therefore I'm not going to linger too long in this area. I'll just touch on a few points. Next, I'm going to talk about what system change looks like on the ground. So, real-life examples of how reform and system change plays out and how it can look different across jurisdictions but contain essentially similar features and guiding principles. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about how people in the field, you all on the line, practitioners, policymakers, and advocates can access tangible tools and resources when looking to undertake similar system reform in your own backyard. So why status offense reform? You see on the slide in front of you that there are a few data points. I'm not going to go over those since you can see them and print them out later. But the key takeaway is similar to what Marie said, is that when it comes to status offenses, we as a country are relying much too heavily on the juvenile justice system. In general, it's interesting. Again, as I noted, we at Vera work on various points of the juvenile justice system, and as many of you know, across the country, there is this trend now that states and localities are seeking to develop and implement strategies to safely and cost-effectively divert youth from the juvenile justice system. Much of that conversation publicly plays out when we're talking about delinquency cases, and unfortunately, status offense reform is not always seen as a hot topic, but we feel strongly that perhaps nowhere is this need for diversion and sort of shrinking the system more important than in the response to and treatment of youth who have not committed a crime but are misbehaving, as Marie pointed out. We also feel that when people in the field are taking on juvenile justice reform, looking at status offenses particularly can set the foundation and tone for that reform. If we don't have luck and if we're not able to show that we can divert young people who have not been charged with a crime, it does not bode well for when jurisdictions try to take on safe and effective diversion for young people that are actually entering the delinquency court. So it's a good and important place to start. So next slide. This is similar again. I'm not going to linger on this. These are some of the additional reasons that reform is needed in the field. Courts are often incredibly overburdened. We hear that in every jurisdiction we work, and therefore they are slow to respond. They are ill-equipped to have the sort of immediate response that many of the young people and families coming in on status offenses need. Also, it's a high financial and social cost of the juvenile justice system. I'm not going to reiterate that because I think Marie already hit that really well. And luckily, there are more effective alternatives. So next slide. What does system change actually look like then? Luckily, a new paradigm has been emerging in many jurisdictions, and that is connect struggling families with social services in their communities instead of turning to courts. We have had the honor of working as part of the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change initiative over the last several years, and status offense reform is something that has been very central to that effort. In particular, we've provided technical assistance and research support in Louisiana and Washington State, two of the states that Marie mentioned that are taking on efforts and having success in sort of shrinking the juvenile justice response to these young people. And so much of what we're going to share with you today sort of stems from what we've learned and what the jurisdictions have learned in those efforts. And in addition, for going back to 2001, we at Vera have provided technical assistance and research to more than 30 jurisdictions in this area. So we're lucky to be able to sort of see the similarities that run through jurisdictions, even while reform efforts are tailored and specific to the size, to the culture, and to the resources of each jurisdiction. So next slide. With that being said, while there's a great deal of variability in terms of what the nuts and bolts of the on-the-ground reform efforts look like, there are some similar and sort of guiding principles and features that we have identified when we're working with jurisdictions and when we're learning about the system change efforts that people have taken on. So you see these here on your slide. I'm going to briefly go over them. First, diversion from court. So keeping kids out of court, which we've been talking about as sort of the thrust of the reform effort, requires having mechanisms in place that actively steer families away from the juvenile justice system and toward community-based services. We stress this a lot when we work with jurisdictions because often policymakers and practitioners, if you first bring up diversion, they'll say, well, there is nothing to divert them to. So it's really, really important in taking on reform efforts when we do our technical assistance to say, absolutely, there needs to be an alternative offered. There needs to be an alternative offer to judges. There needs to be an alternative offer to probation officers and law enforcement on the street so that they feel confident in being able to not turn to the court and that they have something else and something that's been proven to be effective that they can use. Second, we see across the board that an immediate response is critically important when we're talking about status offense reform. Again, many of the families, and we talk about these cases as families, not just young people, because we think it's important for the system to see the young people in the broader context of what's occurring in their home and in their community and really have it be family focused. And these families are asking for and in need of immediate crisis response. It's not the type of thing that a phone call can be made and then they're told that in 3 weeks they're going to be able to talk to someone. Many times in that period of time, the crisis can escalate and increase the chances of later juvenile justice involvement. Third, it's important to have a process to triage cases and diagnose to the root of the problem. So triage we talk about a lot because in the juvenile justice field, as many of you know, it's very important to be using effective screening instruments and assessment instruments. However, it's also important in the status offense realm to make sure that we're not over-assessing and over-intervening in certain cases that may not need it. So the triage comes into place with use of effective screening instruments to really understand which are the young people and families who may simply need a caring and trained adult to listen to them, to help them navigate the immediate crisis and figure out next steps, versus those families that may need much more intensive and long-term support and assistance, and then offering the supports and services that are appropriate based on a later, more in-depth assessment. Fourth, services that are accessible and effective. So accessibility is very important for so many reasons. If they don't have transportation to get to the service, it's not going to work. If it's very cumbersome to even make an appointment or get an appointment, or they have to stay on a wait list for a long time, the service is of no value to them. And effective, obviously, needs to be tested, and there need to be evaluations and some sort of proof in the pudding that the work is actually meaningful and effective for young people. Finally, it's internal assessment, and this essentially means monitoring and evaluating, making sure that there's a constant learning loop, that people are reassessing, making sure that there aren't any unintended consequences, and that the change that people sought out to achieve is actually occurring. So next slide, what system change looks like. I'm going to give 3 examples from the field. I'll do this pretty briefly because you'll have the slides in front of you, so I'm not going to read through them entirely. There are many, many to choose from in the field. Luckily, that's good news for all of us, but we just chose 3 for today. Florida, because it's statewide and because it's one of the first jurisdictions that really took on in a comprehensive manner status offense reform. Calcasieu Parish we'll talk about a little bit in Louisiana because it was one of the key and very successful sites of the Models for Change initiative. And finally, New York State, because we just could not put it in because this is our backyard, and we had a lot of experience and are excited to see the outcomes that they've started to see. So let's start with Florida. And we actually, there's more literature about this to go through. Yeah, go ahead.
You've got about 3 minutes, just FYI.
Okay, that works. So Florida, essentially Florida in the early 1980s were very concerned about runaway youth, and were realizing quite strongly that courts and detention were inappropriate for responding to these young people. So next slide. What they did was essentially develop a statewide network of nonprofit organizations that were community-based to respond directly and immediately within a few matter of hours to young people coming in with a status offense referral. You see the outcomes here. Essentially, I will point out the cost-effective evaluation because I think this is really important for people in the field to show. It showed that over the course of the life of the network, the state has seen a cost avoidance of about $160 million, which is incredibly powerful for legislators, for everyone in the field. So next slide, Calcasieu Parish. Their impetus for change was they were actually doing, in relative terms, a very good job with responding to status offense cases, but they wanted to go even further, and they were concerned that it was taking too long to respond to young people and families that were coming in with needs. So next slide, what they did is they developed what they called a multi-agency resource center, or a MARC. This is a central point of intake where young people and families can get immediate 24-hour attention. I will point out the first bullet of the outcomes, although I think all of these are really important. In 2011, the first year of the MARC, less than 1% of referrals resulted in a court petition. That's just a court petition. When it comes to detention and placement, they're not using that at all. So New York State, this work started back in 2001. You can read here a little bit more as to what the exact impetus was. But essentially, this is an example of local practice driving legislation. So a number of counties, we provided technical assistance to a number of counties. A number of them were able to show that by sort of contracting out to nonprofit organizations to provide, again, that immediate access to crisis interventions for families, they were able to significantly reduce court petitions, and that led to legislative change in 2005 that encouraged and supported similar reform efforts statewide. They saw statewide between 2003 and 2012 a 70% decrease in PINS court petitions. So final slide, very briefly, Marie mentioned this. We are thrilled to be announcing the launch of our Status Offense Reform Center, which is going to go live by mid-December, hopefully December 13th, but should be right around that time. This is funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and it's part of their Resource Center partnership. There are other resource centers that they're funding. And essentially what this is meant to do is, and this has sort of been, a pipe dream of ours for some time, is that while this paradigm shift is occurring, there are many jurisdictions still in the field who want to do similar work and just don't know where to begin. Logistically do not know where to begin. How do I start? Who do I invite to the table? What kind of data do I need to look at? What should this look like? How am I going to fund it? All of those very big questions that can be overwhelming. So this center is not meant to just be a clearinghouse, but an actual how-to guide. So we're producing toolkits. Benjamin, you can go to the next slide. Producing toolkits about how to structure the reform process, how to assess your system, how to plan and implement, and how to monitor and evaluate with resources and tools that people can use along the way. We'll have a library of resources, including the status offense standards that Marie was just mentioning from CJJ, and a number of different products. So we're really thrilled to have this come out. We invite all of you to check it out when it goes live and to be our source for additional information. If there are jurisdictions that you know of in the field that we should be keyed into, then please reach out to us. And that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Annie. Really appreciate it. I want to reiterate for everyone that, especially those of you who have joined somewhere in the middle here, that we will be sending out the slides and posting them. Also, in terms of contact information for our presenters, that will be appearing at the end of the presentation. So if you missed an email address or something like that, it will be on the presentation today, and also the presentation we send out to you. Next up, we have Tara Grishop-Goodwin from Kentucky Youth Advocates, whom I introduced at the beginning. Tara, take it away.
Thank you, Benjamin. Well, good afternoon to everyone. As Benjamin shared earlier, I oversee our policy work here at Kentucky Youth Advocates, which includes our youth justice work. And we are a nonprofit statewide organization that works to improve outcomes for kids. And we work in the areas of economic security, health, education, and certainly in the youth justice arena as well. So I'm going to talk today about some of the advocacy tools we have used to advance reforms and some of the successes that we've seen, as well as some of the additional reforms that we are expecting to see in the near future because of the Juvenile Code Task Force that is currently meeting. So next slide, please. So just quickly, for some context on where Kentucky stands, we and partners started working on the issue of children being placed in secure detention for status offenses several years ago. At that time, Kentucky had the second highest number in the country. Updated numbers still show us at 4th in the nation, but we are seeing progress and hope to see that continue, as I said, with this task force that is underway. So just to show you where we've gone in terms of the numbers, we have cut the number in half since 2007, though we haven't yet made it onto Marie's slide of promising states because we still have a lot of work to do, still remain 4th in the nation. And as you can see on this slide, our numbers in 2012 were still higher than those from 2003 and 2004. So if we move on to the next slide, the advocacy efforts that we've really undertaken along with our partners here in the state have focused on these strategies. I tried to summarize some of the main areas that we worked in. One was really putting the numbers out, publishing the numbers on detention of youth for status offenses. Media work, which included getting our message out to the media about the issue, and really focusing on what the message itself was. So honing a message that was understandable to a broader audience of people who don't work in the justice system, but people who we really needed engaged in the conversation to create change. We can move forward. So publishing the numbers. Early on in our work, we produced an issue brief, which is showing up here, and we have updated it since to document and explain the problem, and also to put forth recommendations. We really found that when we first started working on this issue, many people didn't even know what a status offense was. So we really wanted to not only build that general knowledge, but also put the data out by county. So for each county in our state, we showed the number of bookings, the number of days of secure detention, the total cost to the state based on the average daily bed cost, and the cost that the county picks up in our state, because counties have to pay a portion of that cost. Let's move forward, please. So a complementary strategy to documenting the problem was communicating our message in the media. A big part of that was just putting the fact out that Kentucky had the second highest rate in the nation of locking up youth for status offenses. So here in Kentucky, we are really proud about being number 1, number 2, number 3 in things like basketball. We are not proud of being second highest in something like this. And so we really talked about that in the media, and it generated interest from folks. We released the issue brief that I showed you a copy of, and received coverage of that issue in the newspaper, on the radio, and in many other publications. Really, it was the county numbers that got people talking a lot. In some cases, we saw local judges taking action. In one county, actually, if you don't mind backing up one for a little minute first. Thanks, Benjamin. We had a county that convened partners and organized a community meeting. It was attended by over 100 people to talk about how to address the high number of incarcerations. And you can see on the slide here, northernkentucky.com, this is the website for one of the local newspapers. And the judge referred to this article and said he didn't want to see the county be number 1 again. So it did spur some action. We also saw that the numbers raised awareness of the problem and generated community conversations. So this slide just shows a sampling of that media coverage, but it really was, media really played a huge role in creating an environment where people moved from talking about what is a status offense to recognizing collectively that something needed to be done to address the problem. Next slide, please. So a core piece of that media work, and also our work to engage stakeholders and community members, was thinking about the message itself. We knew that we had to avoid jargon. People don't know what status offenses are unless they work in the court system or in the justice system. So we had to come up with a plain language way of talking about it. In some cases, we didn't even actually use the term status offenses, but started using the description of it that was more intuitive for people. So we talked about things like, we said youth getting locked up for things like skipping school or running away from home. And that was something that resonated with people who weren't involved in the issue. We also have talked a lot about public safety in our message, and that mirrors some of the points that were made earlier by the first presenters. We know that the public cares about public safety and accountability, and so we talked about how incarcerating youth for minor things can actually increase the chance that they commit offenses in the future. So we talked about holding youth accountable, but doing it with other methods that are more effective. So this message we found to be especially important in light of some of the anecdotal stories that emerged as we were working on the issue, where we would hear someone talk about an individual person who they saw be transformed by being incarcerated. So it has been extremely important to be able to talk about what the research shows us to counter that. And it has also been extremely helpful to have strong leaders that have looked at that research and that know what the overwhelming evidence shows and have been willing to talk about that publicly. And we have a number of folks here in the state, judges, commissioner of juvenile justice, county attorneys who have been willing to talk about that publicly. Another piece of that message was about the cost of secure detention. And while that didn't really drive the conversation, it has been an important piece of the message. And one of the talking points that my executive directors use sometimes is that it costs more for a night in detention at the fanciest hotel in Louisville, Kentucky than it does to house a child in a detention center. So again, it's getting people's attention, having them think about what is most effective and where we want to use our resources. We also made sure in our message to always talk about the solution and show that there are options out there that work. that work better and get the core result that we want. So some of the successes that we've seen. As the earlier slide showed with the data, we have started to see a decrease in the numbers of youth detained over the past couple of years, and there really have been a number of factors that have contributed. Some of the early efforts resulted in changes to the family court rules of procedure and practice that took effect back in January of 2011. And these really focused on curbing the number of cases that would come into the court system, really focusing on schools and requiring schools to show the interventions that they've tried before a habitual truancy or a beyond control of school complaint could be accepted by the courts. We've also seen a number of local initiatives that have played a huge role in improving numbers for kids in the counties. And beyond that, they've also shown the state that things can be done differently, that we can get services to kids without taking them into the court system and without placing them with the Department of Juvenile Justice. So just a couple briefly, in Henderson County, there's a program that was created in partnership with DJJ, or Department of Juvenile Justice, to place a staffer in the school to do preventative work and connect the child with services to prevent charges from even needing to be filed. And another example is that we've had a Campbell County judge who's convened a team to look at cases early in the court process and identify underlying problems that are contributing to the child's behavior, and then work to connect that child with services. That project goes way beyond just ordering a child to do something, which is where the valid court order exception comes into play, and really says, let's figure out what the core issue is and address it. So finally, Kentucky has had a task force in place. It's in its second year now, and they have been studying and are preparing to recommend changes to the juvenile code. The task force has two very strong leaders that have guided this work, and they've really been grounded in the research and what the numbers say, which has been a very positive and encouraging process. They also have the support of Pew Charitable Trust in analyzing the data and looking at what is driving the numbers into the system. So they are at the point now of starting to work on developing recommendations, and a number of positive things are being discussed that we see addressing this issue of status offenses. So these pieces kind of echo what we heard from our earlier speakers as well, but a focus on getting services to youth early on in the system, or even before they get involved with the court system, is one thing that the task force is looking at. We're also looking at the Illinois and Ohio models of fiscal incentives to counties to provide services in the communities. What we hear a lot is that, as Annie referred to, people say there aren't resources for judges to use. And so looking at ways that we can get services into communities so children can be served there instead of being removed from their homes or placed in detention or in some other out-of-home placement. Another thing that is being discussed is looking at handling status offense cases as dependency, neglect, and abuse cases if services aren't resolving the issue and the case does need to come to court. And then finally, a piece that is very relevant to status offenders, but also for public offenders, is looking at a strong risk and needs assessment to make sure that we can direct them to appropriate services. So those are the things that are on the horizon, and really the task force is in the midst right now of developing what those recommendations are going to be, but we feel pretty certain that status offenses will get addressed in a strong and positive way. And so hopefully we will make it onto a slide by CJJ in the near future where Kentucky has made some great improvements in this area. Thank you, Benjamin.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tara, and also thank you to all of our speakers today. I've put up the slide with our contact information if you happen to have some follow-up questions. We also had some questions from the audience that we're going to, I'm going to ask my colleague Melissa Goman to moderate. But if you have additional questions, feel free to put them into the chat box, and we will deal with them as we can. Melissa?
Sure. So one of the first questions we got had to do with whether there was data indicating that in states where they eliminated status offenses, was there any kind of corresponding increase in delinquency offenses? I think the point being that we're prosecutors now charging kids with delinquency offenses in order to try to keep what are really status offenders in the delinquency system. That was a question from Erin Davies. I think it was directed to Marie, but if any of you have answers, Marie could answer, if anybody else.
You know, I don't have any information or actual data to support that contention. I mean, I've heard some anecdotal stuff that, you know, we see increases in delinquent offenses when there's a violation of a probation order or something, and then what was an underlying status offense becomes charged up to a delinquent offense. So we've seen that, but I don't think we've seen a direct correlation between places where they don't have the VCO, and so kids are charged up at the outset. I don't know, Annie, have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I'll add, the only thing I would add, I mean, unfortunately, there's very little statewide data, you know, across the country that really tracks things like this. But though Florida has done a good job, as I was mentioning, of tracking their data, and that cost avoidance study that I mentioned that, you know, pointed out like $160 million in cost avoidance. Part of that, and we can, if people are interested, we can send out a link to that and explore that in more detail, but part of that was based on a decrease in kids then later having delinquency charges. So I'm assuming, but I may be wrong here, I'm assuming that that was immediate, you know, also looked at any immediate uptick in those cases to delinquency. So that's the only one I can think of offhand that's for Florida, but it is statewide. So it does get to that public safety issue and that possible, like, you know, ratcheting up the charge. But nationally, I don't think there's any research on that.
Okay, great. Then we had a question from Sid Savitz. I think this was also directed to Marie. He wanted to know where you got these statistics that show that 50% of status offenders were placed with offenders who've committed rape or homicide.
Yeah, I mean, for citation-specific questions, I would ask that folks email me, and then I can send you the actual citation. But yeah, I would be happy to do that. I just don't have it on hand, but I'd be happy to send that out.
Okay. And then Myra Weeks wanted to know if any of you have looked at roles of the youth courts or peer courts in this process.
No, we have not at Vera specifically for these cases.
Okay. Yeah, I would say this.
That hasn't been a part of the conversation specifically in Kentucky either, but that might be taking place out in the counties that are working on things. I know that there are lots of counties are trying different things, different strategies, and we have truancy diversion programs, but I don't know specifically about youth courts.
Yeah, and I will say, this is Annie, I will say that a lot of the examples that we've looked at before, like in Maricopa County and other places where there is a model of places using truancy courts in the school. And I don't remember all the details of each of those. They may include young people, but I think it's basically like a proxy for court, but it's in the school and it's not an actual court. But I don't think it's premised on the youth court model per se. Like it would have a guidance counselor and people like that.
Okay. Okay. If there's any others, let's see. Okay. Michael wanted to know if there are efforts being made to create databases letting officers know what youth might have already Okay, whether there are efforts being made to create databases letting officers know what youth might have had adverse childhood experiences to eliminate further trauma.
I mean, that, and Annie, you could probably speak to this better than I can, but I know that in Florida and places where they have a CHINS and FIN system, those are parallel systems. They don't interact with the juvenile justice system, at least not in terms of sharing information. So,
right.
So if a young person has trauma and they're in the CHINS system and, for whatever reason committed an offense that was a delinquent offense, I'm not sure that that information would be immediately accessible to an arresting officer.
I think that's right, and I'm not sure if the question,
or if they're being detained for a status offense, would they have access to that information? Is that the
yeah,
question?
I'm not sure which it may have been, I don't know.
Yeah,
but I will say, Marie is totally right on the delinquency side. If the question is about if the young person is coming in on a status offense, that would possibly come into that screening and assessment process that we talked about before, but not for law enforcement. I can't think of an example where the law enforcement for status offense cases would be doing that type of screening and assessment. It's usually that they, in places that have done this sort of comprehensively, there's a place that the law enforcement officer can bring the young person, and that not a juvenile justice drop-off point, but where they can then screen to know whether the young person is in the child welfare system or has had trauma.
One specific point in Kentucky, and this certainly isn't at the level of having a database for law enforcement that covers all adverse childhood experiences, but we passed a human trafficking bill last session, and the law enforcement members are going to be trained on that, on screening for that. Our historical practice was to take kids who were suspected to be victims of human trafficking to secure detention centers because that was what we had available. So luckily that process has been changed and there will be training. Again, that's different than having a database. But, with Kentucky leading the nation in kids with adverse childhood experiences, that's an interesting thing to consider.
Okay. We have another question wanting to know if there's any community-based models that have been evaluated. So I guess they want to know if there's data or resources discussing, what would be the key features of effective models of community-based alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Well, the examples that I shared where there's definitely been monitoring, the way that we at Vera usually talk about it is that there's outcomes that are tracked, and there are lots of places in the field that have very good outcomes. Many of the ones that we talked about, Cook County, Illinois, Florida, New York, Calcasieu, all these different places that have very promising outcomes where they're able to look at how young people fared after, what was the impact on juvenile justice, cost, and all that. There are very few places that have that rigorous evaluation with like a controlled, sample, and that is very hard to achieve, which is part of the reason why when we as a field talk about evidence-based practice, it's like this tiny, tiny group of programs and interventions because not many places have had the benefit of that type of rigor. So I do think that there are many examples of good outcomes. When it comes to the gold star standards of evidence that would be able to have like a controlled sample and all of that, it's a pretty slim picking, which is the case across the board in juvenile justice, not just with status offense reform.
Okay. And then there's another question wanting to know if you know of any state legislation abolishing incarceration. I assume they mean for status offenses.
Could you repeat that, Melissa? I'm sorry.
Yeah, whether there's any recent state legislation that abolished incarceration for status offenses.
That abolished. I mean, I don't think we've seen any that have abolished. I know that the Georgia Code was reformed to make it more difficult, but no abolition that I know of recently. No.
Yeah, I can't think of anything either. When we're including the placement as a disposition, I don't think there's any example.
Okay. And those are all the questions. It looks like that's perfect timing because it's 4:56. So Benjamin, did you have anything else to add before we end?
No, I just wanted to thank our speakers very much for attending, and also to thank our attendees actually for your thoughtful questions as well. As I have said several times, we will send out the slides and a link to the recording to all registrants. So we will be getting that out in the next day or so, I hope. Feel free to contact our speakers if you have any sort of really specific questions, or feel free to contact us here at NJJN and we can forward them. Thanks very much, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.